Welcome to this bonus episode of the Third Sector podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda Rouse, and with me in the studio are Andy Ricketts.
Hello.
And Emily Harle.
Hi.
Both of whom are fresh out of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising's annual convention, which took place last week at London's QE2 Conference Centre. This is the UK's largest meeting of fundraising professionals, and 2026 was a particularly significant year because it's actually the last time the CIoF plans to host it in its full form. There were about 1,000 people attending on each of the 2 days. Andy, you've attended quite a few of these over the past 25 years, I think it's correct to say.
Yes, I have. And yeah, it's fair to say that it does feel like a bit of an end of an era from my point of view, simply because the convention has been such a massive part of the fundraising calendar. It's always been a huge event, but it has got smaller in recent years. When I first started going to the convention in the sort of late 2000s, it used to be a 3-day event. Third Sector used to do a daily magazine that was produced for people at the convention about all the stuff that was going on, which was great fun, but it meant I'd live in a broom cupboard basically for 3 days. Obviously, the convention has slimmed down to 2, and I think the effects of COVID and how that's affected how people interact with each other and how conferences run and people's appetite for coming to these sort of events has changed. So yeah, it does feel like the end of an era, but we look forward to whatever the CIoF's going to put in place in terms of the evolved offering that it's going to have.
Do we know why they've decided to scrap their full convention?
I think there are 2 main reasons from what I understand. One is that they want to be able to offer more specialist conference events that just last maybe 1 day, because one of the senior CIoF people described the current event as a bit of a blancmange, in the sense that it's trying to be all things to all people, that there are so many sessions, you know, even at any one time there might be like 10 different streams that are going on. It can feel quite overwhelming for anyone who's trying to attend for the first time. And I think they want to be a bit more targeted in terms of who they get going to the various events. So they're going to do one that's more of a leadership stream and one that's more of a frontline fundraiser stream. I think the other thing is cost. I mean, you mentioned it's at the QE2 Conference Centre. It must cost a fortune.
And before we go on to what happened last week, I wanted to ask you, given the number of years that you've been attending this event and sitting in a broom cupboard, which is news to me, do you have a particularly memorable convention moment?
Well, I mean, I was part of a world record.
Oh, right.
At the legendary convention party, which always used to take place on the Tuesday night, they decided that they were going to try to break the world record for the highest number of people doing the Agadoo dance. So I actually was a record breaker briefly. I don't know if that record still stands, but they got about, 300, 400 people all doing the Agadoo dance.
And for anybody who's not aware, what is the Agadoo dance?
Well,
can you please show us?
That's a good question. Well, as this is an audio medium, that could be a bit tricky, but it was a early 1980s corny pop song that got to number 1 that had an associated dance routine.
Next time we need to record on video so we can get Andy doing it.
Yes, I did it under duress at the time, so I don't think I'll do it again very freely here.
Emily Harle, last week, any dancing for you?
No dancing, unfortunately, but a lot of chatting. It's interesting hearing Andy talk about convention because I'm very new to fundraising convention. Last year was my first time attending, and this year was only my second. And while the room still felt really vibrant and full of energy, fundraisers always are. It's one of the things I love about going to these events. You can definitely see why the CIoF may have taken this decision because, as you said, Andy, there's so many sessions to choose from. I mean, we were struggling to pick out what would be best for news and what we could attend and to try and make the most of the 2 days that we had there. And on day 1, it was just me running about like a headless chicken, really.
Just while you've been talking there, I've got this vision in my head of this fundraising blancmange being no more. I find that actually very sad. But on to the specifics of some of the discussions. We're going to cover just a couple because, as you say, there was so much choice. Emily, let's start with you. What was a session that particularly grabbed your attention?
one of the highlights for me was a panel that was called From Silos to Synergy. And it was all about blending your major giving fundraising with your legacies fundraising, which I thought was such a, interesting and kind of novel prospect in a way, because the structure of many charities are not necessarily designed to enable that blended giving, one donor journey approach, because you've got all these different income streams and often different teams working within that, especially if you're a major charity. So the panel, which was made up of a range of philanthropy and legacy leaders, they talked about the benefits and barriers of blending your fundraising into a single donor proposition, a single donor journey. And Lorraine Hare, who is the director of global philanthropy at the Harle Trust, made a really good point that donors don't think in income streams, right? To them, it's all part of their journey with the charity. And so the fundraisers essentially need to stop being so precious about their donors and allow them to move between teams. So, for example, your major donors, they're giving good amounts of money throughout their life. They're occasionally making quite big donations. And then you've got the prospect of, would they leave a legacy? But the sort of structure that's needed to be able to blend that into a single proposition and really drip feed that legacy messaging into your pre-existing relationship with that donor, it's not necessarily enabled. So I thought that was so interesting. And then Harbe Jama, who was most recently a philanthropy and partnerships director at Impetus, he made a very good but also quite funny point when he said, you don't get a bonus, so maybe calm down. Let's not be so precious about our donors. Let's enable them to go to the person, on whether that's in your philanthropy team or in your legacies team, go to the person who's right for them and enable that smooth donor journey throughout.
I wonder if there was any pushback to that idea. It makes sense. And like you say, there's no bonuses involved. So obviously you shouldn't be working in competition with even other charities working in your same cause area, let alone internally. So why isn't it happening? And did anybody have any objection to this idea?
So there wasn't so much an objection, but there was some discussion about the barriers to enabling this blended giving approach. And one of the barriers that was talked about quite a lot is just the fact that fundraisers across the board are not getting training on how to talk about grief. And with legacy fundraisers, they are obviously talking about grief all the time. This is what they do. And they know how to talk to a donor about potentially leaving a gift in their will. But for other fundraisers, they're not as clued up on that most of the time. And so he was talking about the need for training people to be able to talk about that sort of gifts and wills conversation, so it can be drip fed into your pre-existing donor relationships, regardless of what team you're working in.
I'm curious to know why grief comes into it, though, because if you're very much alive and thinking about writing your will, you're not really going to be thinking about grief, are you, when you're deciding whether or not to pledge a gift to a charity when you're gone?
I guess it's more our attitude in the UK about death and dying is sort of stiff upper lip. We don't talk about it. And
Right.
So it's not necessarily grief, but if you've experienced grief, you might have it a bit easier in navigating those conversations because you know exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about legacies. This money is not going to pass to the charity until you're gone. And that's quite a confrontational conversation to have with someone.
Yeah, I get what you mean, sort of end of life admin paperwork when a major proportion of the UK public has not written a will. So trying to stimulate that as well.
But then there was also some really interesting chat about engaging the next generation of donors within that. And again, Harbe Jama was talking about how younger donors are sort of, the way you engage with them is going to be very different. And the way that if you have that blended giving approach built in right from the get-go, then it makes it easier to have them start thinking about that. And maybe they'll write a will and they'll leave a gift when they're in their 20s, 30s. And research shows that if someone leaves a gift in their first will, that is likely to stay or grow as they continue to evolve their wills when they update it.
Lots of big topics there. Andy, you wanted to talk about small shifts.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the overall theme for convention this year was small shifts, big impact. And there was definitely noticeable that there was loads of sessions throughout the couple of days that talked about little things that charities can do and fundraisers can do to try to raise that little bit more money. And I think that was quite an interesting insight in itself, in the sense of, I think charities are obviously finding things hard at the moment in terms of fundraising, and they're looking for some quite easy wins, ones that don't require much in the way of investment, because there's maybe not a great deal of extra cash lying around at the moment for new ventures. So what little things can we do to really bring a bit more cash in? I went to a really interesting session with Marina Jones from the English National Opera and Meredith Niles, who formerly is Director of Fundraising at Marie Curie, talking about the psychology of giving and little things that charities can do to just try to move the dial slightly when it comes to their fundraising activities. And one of them was, maybe to reference another 1980s pop song, The Power of Love, in the sense of, they said that studies had shown that if you introduce the concept of love when you're asking someone about something, and they quoted the example of somebody in a Parisian street going up and asking for Valentine's Square or something like that. And because you've introduced that idea of love and Valentine's, people are apparently more willing to help you. And they've said that they found that if you put a heart in your fundraising communications, maybe on the Give Now button, or you introduce that concept of love, then people are more likely to give more money, which is kind of surprising. But it's just a very subtle way of nudging people into making an extra donation.
It's so interesting, because I also attended a session on the first day that brought in this idea of love and the psychology of philanthropy. And it was a session that had two speakers from the RSPCA, and it explored the charity's rebrand and how the rebrand really changed the positioning and the messaging that the charity was giving to potential donors. So it moved away from, this is a dog in crisis, to looking at, these are the happy animals that have been helped. And yeah, that's what they've found to be more effective.
And there are other things too. They talked about the power of storytelling, which was quite interesting in terms of anchoring things in individual stories. Like, for example, they gave the case of a charity that told the story of one individual child who was starving and needed help versus 3 million people who were starving and needed help. And the fundraising campaign that did better was the one that told the story of one person, because they felt that people can't really get their heads around 3 million people. It's too many. They also talked about the power of suggestion in terms of numbers, and they did a little experiment in the room. If you see other people have given higher amounts, then that probably subconsciously affects the amount that you're like to give. Things like that sort of came out that were really interesting.
Emily, I understand that you went to an interesting session on corporate partnerships.
Yeah, so this session was all about moving from transactional to transformational corporate partnerships. And it was interesting to me because it gave both the charity and the corporate perspective. So it had a speaker from WWF UK and a speaker from NatWest, which is a corporate partner of the charity. And because of this sort of dual perspective, it ended up being a really, really practical session. And I think people came away from it having learnt a lot of little tidbits that they could take away with them and really implement in their everyday. So the speaker from WWF was the charity's senior partnerships manager, Diana Winpenny, which is a great name if you're in the business of fundraising. And she gave some really good nuggets of wisdom. Things like getting an NDA before sitting down with the business, provided both parties agree to this, which can then enable a more in-depth conversation, because the company is then not concerned about how that information shared within that meeting is going to be used. And I hadn't heard anyone talking about this before. She is right. That does give a lot more room for movement within that conversation, a lot more openness, and you can share a lot with each other and really co-create. And she also told delegates to approach corporates with a management consultant mindset, which I thought was really interesting. So by that, she meant going in with a curiosity about the problems that the business is trying to solve, rather than going in as like a salesperson trying to pitch or a fundraiser with a begging bowl, as she described it. You're trying to figure out how you, as a charity, can help the business solve its problems. So things like, if a company has specific sustainability goals, how is partnering with you as a charity going to help it reach those goals? And then you need to make that case. So go in, talk their language, using words like resilience and risk, and make sure you're talking in the same language that the company is using, because otherwise you're just going in and saying like, look, we're helping all of these pandas. But the company doesn't care about that. It doesn't affect their bottom line. It doesn't help their sustainability goals. You need to make the case to why funding this program is actually going to boost the company in the eyes of its consumers, and how it's going to benefit either their consumers, their employees, or the brands.
Really interesting how the pandas could actually help NatWest. What was the reception like to this panel from people in the room?
Everyone was listening very attentively, and I saw a lot of people scribbling down notes, which is always a good sign during a session like this. And there was a Q&A section where someone did ask how you navigate a situation where a company has pledged a donation or, you know, some sort of financial commitment to fund a program or whatever, how you then push back if it's too small. How do you politely go, thank you, but that's not quite what we're needing here to be able to fund this work? And I thought Diana's answer to this was fascinating, because she said she does this quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And the way she does it is by telling the company that the funding commitment needs to be credible. And by that, I mean, if a massive organisation that's earning millions has pledged a $5,000 donation to a charity, that is not necessarily going to play very well with the media and with consumers, because it's not going to seem genuine. It's not going to seem like it's coming from a genuine place. And that is how fundraisers can push back, she said.
What, sort of say, oh, it's not going to sit well with the public if you're only giving this amount?
Maybe not quite saying it like that, but she said she sits down with them and she opens a conversation about, this is great, but we need to make this support credible and something that both the charity and the company's audiences can stand behind, and that's going to play well with their audiences. And I noticed when she was answering this that she was talking about the company and the charity as a we. And I think that's quite key here as well, because sitting down having this conversation could be really jarring. It could come across as a bit, why are you not being grateful for the money that's been pledged? But actually, this is how you enter a productive co-created partnership, is by having those tough conversations, but talking about it as a we.
And that in itself is living the spirit of partnership, not just a charity receiving funds from a wealthy corporate donor. It's really heartening to hear that there was so much optimism and positivity coming out of these discussions, because I know that sometimes we get into a little bit of a cycle of doom, thinking about how much more expensive it is to be raising money. But hearing of really successful forms of partnership, hearing about the new generation of donors and how charities can be adapting to new forms of giving and new attitudes towards giving, it all sounds really exciting. And great to hear as well that there are going to be more interesting, tailored, less blancmange type events put on by the CIoF in the future to take these conversations forward.
I mean, that is the nature of fundraisers, though, isn't it, really? There's always good energy when they come together, because they are the sort of, they're the Tiggers of the voluntary sector, if you like. You know, if maybe the bean counters and the finance individuals are the Eeyores, but the fundraisers are very much the Tiggers, they're always going to be upbeat. So when people come together, there's always positive energy. And we definitely felt that, even though it's a difficult time for fundraising at the moment.
Yeah, and we definitely heard from some people as well. I know I definitely heard from some people about how things are tough, and there was definitely acknowledgement of that. No one's burying their head in the sand, but the energy, the opportunity to learn from peers is just very much the reason that people come to these events, and why people are so excited to be there.
And on that note, if you went to convention and you want a bit more, or if you missed out this time and you think, I would really like to go to a meeting of charity professionals this month, the Third Sector Conference is taking place on the 23rd and 24th of June in London, covering fundraising, leadership, finance, a special stream just for small charities. It promises to be a great event. We're all going to be there. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode. You can read a healthy clutch of news stories written by Emily and Andy from the convention on the Third Sector website. We'll be back again on Friday for our usual weekly episode, and our producer is Jude Owen.